The summer heat was thick in North Carolina that Tuesday evening. Staff Sergeant David Johnson was driving through the quiet streets of his hometown, windows down, enjoying the familiar sights he had missed during his long months overseas. After 3 tours in Afghanistan as a Marine sniper, coming home always felt like stepping into a different world. David had earned his place among the military's finest. His steady hands and sharp eyes had saved countless lives during dangerous missions. His fellow Marines trusted him completely. When bullets flew and chaos erupted, they knew David would keep them safe. He wore his uniform with pride and carried himself with the quiet confidence that comes from serving your country with honor. At 28 years old, David had seen more action than most soldiers twice his age. He had crawled through desert, sand under enemy fire, spent countless hours watching through his scope, and made split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death for his brothers in arms. His chest was covered with ribbons and medals that told the story of his service. Purple Heart for wounds received in battle, Bronze Star for heroic achievement, expert marksman badges that showed his deadly accuracy. But none of that mattered as he drove through the streets near Camp Lejeune that evening. He was just another young man heading home after a long day, looking forward to a quiet evening with his family. The red and blue lights appeared in his rearview mirror without warning. David felt his heart sink. He pulled over carefully, keeping his hands visible on the steering wheel just as he had been trained. "Stay calm," he told himself. "This is just routine." Officer Williams stepped out of his patrol car, hand resting on his weapon. His partner, Officer Davis, took position on the passenger side. Both men approached with the kind of tension that David recognized from his military training. But this wasn't a war zone. This was his hometown. "License and registration," Officer Williams demanded, his voice sharp and unfriendly. David moved slowly, announcing each action before he made it. "I'm reaching for my wallet now," he said calmly. "It's in my back pocket." Years of military discipline had taught him to stay composed under pressure. He handed over his documents along with his military identification card. Officer Williams barely glanced at the military ID. "You know why I stopped you?" he asked, studying David's face with obvious suspicion. "No, sir, I don't," David replied honestly. He had been driving carefully, staying well within the speed limit. His car was properly registered and maintained. He couldn't think of any reason for the stop. "You were speeding," the officer claimed, though David knew this wasn't true. "Where are you coming from?" "I was visiting a friend's family," David explained. "Another Marine from my unit. His mom made dinner for some of us who just got back from deployment." The explanation seemed to make Officer Williams more suspicious, not less. "What's a guy like you doing in this neighborhood?" he asked, looking around at the well-kept houses and manicured lawns. David felt a chill run down his spine. He had heard this tone before, seen these looks. During his deployments, he had fought alongside Marines of every background. Black, white, Hispanic, Asian. None of that mattered when you were watching each other's backs in combat. But here, in his own country, he could feel the weight of judgment in the officer's stare. "Like I said, sir, I was visiting friends," David repeated, keeping his voice steady and respectful. Officer Williams walked back to his patrol car to run David's information. Everything came back clean, of course. No warrants, no criminal history, not even a parking ticket. David's record was spotless, both as a civilian and as a Marine. But when Officer Williams returned, his attitude had only gotten worse. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered. David's military training kicked in. He had been taught to follow lawful orders from authority figures, but he also knew his rights. "May I ask why, sir?" "I smell marijuana," Officer Williams claimed, though David had never used drugs in his life. Random drug testing in the military made sure of that. "I need to search your vehicle." David felt his world starting to tilt. This was exactly the kind of situation he had hoped never to face. "Sir, I respectfully decline the search. I know my rights. If you believe you have probable cause, I'd like to contact my commanding officer at Camp Lejeune." The mention of his rights seemed to anger both officers. Officer Davis called for backup while Officer Williams ordered David out of the car again, this time with more force in his voice. David complied, moving slowly and keeping his hands visible. He had survived firefights in Afghanistan by staying calm under pressure. He could handle this situation the same way. But as he stood beside his car, hands at his sides, he felt more vulnerable than he ever had in combat. More patrol cars arrived within minutes. The quiet residential street suddenly looked like a crime scene, with flashing lights reflecting off nearby houses. Curious neighbors began to peer out their windows and step onto their porches. David could see the confusion in their faces. What was happening? Why were so many police officers surrounding one young man in his sedan? "He's being uncooperative," Officer Williams told the newly arrived officers, though David had done nothing but ask questions and assert his constitutional rights. The situation escalated quickly after that. David found himself face down on the airy, hot asphalt, his hands forced behind his back as cold metal handcuffs clicked around his wrists. The rough pavement scraped against his cheek as officers searched through his spotless car. "I'm a United States Marine," David said, his voice muffled against the ground. "I just got back from Afghanistan. Please contact Camp Lejeune." But his words seemed to fall on deaf ears. The officers treated him like any common criminal. Despite his military ID, despite his clean record, despite his respectful behavior throughout the entire encounter. They searched every inch of his car. The trunk, under the seats, in the glove compartment, even inside his military duffel bag that contained his uniforms and personal items from deployment. They found nothing because there was nothing to find. No drugs, no weapons, except those he was legally authorized to carry as military personnel. No evidence of any wrongdoing whatsoever. Still, they arrested him. The charges were vague and seemed almost made up on the spot. Resisting arrest, though David had followed every order. Disorderly conduct, though he had been nothing but polite and respectful. It was as if they needed to justify the stop, the search, and the arrest by creating crimes that didn't exist, and David sat in the back of the patrol car, his hands cuffed behind him. He stared out at the neighborhood where he had grown up. These were the streets where he had played as a child, where he had dreamed of serving his country and making his family proud. Now those same streets felt foreign and hostile. The ride to the county jail was silent except for the radio chatter between officers. David listened as they coordinated their stories, making sure their reports would match. They talked about him like he wasn't there, like he was just another problem to be processed and forgotten. At the jail, David was fingerprinted, photographed, and placed in a holding cell. The booking officer asked routine questions about his background, and when David mentioned his military service, the man showed the first sign of respect he had received all evening. "What unit?" the booking officer asked. "Marine Corps, 2nd Battalion," David replied. "Just finished my 3rd deployment." The booking officer paused in his paperwork. "My son's in the Army," he said quietly. "Deployed to Iraq last year." For a moment, there was understanding between them. But it didn't change David's situation. The holding cell was small and smelled of disinfectant and despair. David sat on the hard bench and tried to make sense of what had happened. A few hours ago, he had been laughing with friends, sharing stories about their time overseas, planning for their future. Now he was facing criminal charges that could destroy his military career. He thought about his fellow Marines still overseas, the ones who were counting on him to be there when they needed backup. He thought about his family, who would be devastated to learn about his arrest. Most of all, he thought about the contradiction of serving his country overseas while being treated like a criminal at home. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had spent months protecting American freedoms in a foreign land, only to have his own freedoms violated on American soil. He had risked his life for strangers in Afghanistan, but couldn't get basic respect from police officers in his own hometown. As the night wore on, David remained calm and dignified. It was the same composure that had made him an excellent sniper and a trusted leader of Marines. But inside, he felt something breaking. Not his spirit, but his faith in the system he had sworn to protect. He didn't know it yet, but his arrest had already been reported to Camp Lejeune. His commanding officers were reviewing the police reports and body camera footage. Military lawyers were being consulted. And somewhere in the Pentagon, a 4-star general was about to learn about the case that would define her legacy. David spent that night in jail, staring at the ceiling and wondering if his military career was over before it had really begun. He couldn't have imagined that his case would soon reach the highest levels of military command, or that a general he had never met would risk her own reputation to defend him. All he knew was that he had been failed by the very system he had sworn to protect. But sometimes when the system fails, it takes extraordinary people in positions of power to make things right again. The news traveled fast through Camp Lejeune. By dawn the next morning, word of David's arrest had reached the base. In the military, news like this spreads like wildfire, especially when it involves one of their best Marines. Captain Lisa Rodriguez was just finishing her morning coffee when her phone rang. As David's company commander, she had worked closely with him for over 2 years. She knew his character better than most people knew their own family members. When she heard what had happened, her first reaction was disbelief. "There has to be some mistake," she told the military police officer on the phone. "David Johnson is one of the most professional Marines I've ever commanded. He doesn't even drink alcohol, let alone get into trouble with civilian police." But there was no mistake. The arrest was real, and the charges were serious enough to potentially end David's military career. Captain Rodriguez immediately began making phone calls. She contacted the base legal office, the military police, and most importantly, Colonel Robert Thompson, the commanding officer of the entire base. Colonel Thompson had been in the Marines for 25 years. He had seen good Marines get caught up in situations that weren't their fault, and he had also seen bad Marines try to blame others for their mistakes. But when he looked at David's service record, he knew this was different. David's file told the story of an exemplary Marine. Perfect physical fitness scores, expert marksmanship ratings that put him in the top 1% of all Marines, leadership courses completed with honors. Most importantly, his performance evaluations from 3 combat deployments showed a Marine who could be trusted with the most dangerous and important missions. "Get me everything," Colonel Thompson told his staff. "Police reports, body camera footage, witness statements, everything. And I want our best military lawyers on this case immediately." The military investigation began within hours of David's arrest. This wasn't just about one Marine anymore. It was about the relationship between the military and the civilian community. It was about protecting Marines who served their country with honor. And it was about making sure the truth came to light. Master Sergeant Patricia Williams was assigned to lead the military police investigation. She had been an investigator for over 15 years and had seen every kind of case imaginable. But when she started reviewing David's case, she felt her anger rising with each page she read. The police report told one story. It claimed David had been speeding, acting suspicious and resisting arrest. It painted him as an uncooperative suspect who had forced the officers to use necessary force. But the body camera footage told a completely different story. Master Sergeant Williams watched the footage over and over again. She saw David's respectful behavior throughout the entire encounter. She heard him announce his movements before reaching for his wallet. She watched him comply with every lawful order while politely asserting his constitutional rights. Most importantly, she saw no evidence of the crimes he had been charged with. "This is textbook profiling," she told Colonel Thompson during their first meeting. "Every protocol that Marine followed during that traffic stop came straight from our training manuals. He did everything right and they arrested him anyway." The investigation expanded beyond just reviewing the immediate incident. Military investigators began looking into the history between local police and military personnel. What they found was disturbing. Over the past 2 years, there had been dozens of complaints from Marines about their treatment by local police. Most of these complaints came from Marines of color, and many followed the same pattern as David's case. Traffic stops for minor or non-existent violations. Claims of suspicious behavior when Marines acted according to their military training. Searches based on questionable probable cause. Arrests on vague charges that rarely led to convictions. Lieutenant Colonel Jennifer Davis was the base's staff judge advocate, essentially the top military lawyer at Camp Lejeune. She had been practicing military law for over a decade and had never seen a case quite like David's. The evidence was so clear-cut that she wondered how the local police had thought they could get away with it. They didn't count on the military investigating, she explained to her staff. They probably thought this would be just another case that would quietly disappear through the civilian court system. They didn't realize that we protect our own. The military lawyers began building David's defense case, but they also started documenting a pattern of behavior that went far beyond one incident. They interviewed other Marines who had similar experiences. They collected evidence of disparate treatment. They built a case that showed David's arrest wasn't an isolated incident but part of a larger problem. Meanwhile, David sat in his jail cell, unaware of the massive investigation taking place on his behalf. He had been allowed one phone call, which he used to contact his family. The conversation was brief and heartbreaking. His mother cried. His father promised to find a way to help. His younger sister, who had always looked up to her big brother the Marine, couldn't understand how this had happened. Back at Camp Lejeune, David's fellow Marines were rallying around him. The Marines in his unit knew David's character. They had served with him in combat. They had trusted him to watch their backs in the most dangerous situations imaginable. If someone like David could be arrested for no reason, then none of them were safe. Sergeant First Class Michael Chen had served 2 deployments with David. He remembered a particular mission in Afghanistan where David's quick thinking and steady aim had saved their entire unit from an ambush. Now that same Marine was sitting in a civilian jail, charged with crimes everyone knew he didn't commit. "We need to do something," Chen told Captain Rodriguez. "David would do the same for any of us." Captain Rodriguez was already working on it. She had been in contact with military legal services, and they were preparing to provide David with the best defense possible. But she was also thinking bigger. This case could set a precedent for how civilian police treated military personnel. It could change policies and procedures that affected thousands of Marines. The investigation revealed more troubling details. The officers who arrested David had a history of complaints against them. Officer Williams had been investigated twice for excessive force, though no disciplinary action had been taken. Officer Davis had been accused of racial profiling in 3 separate incidents over the past year. More importantly, the investigation showed that the local police department had received federal funding specifically for programs designed to improve relations with the military community. That money was supposed to be used for training and outreach programs. Instead, it appeared that the department had done nothing to address the ongoing problems between police and military personnel. Colonel Thompson called a meeting with the base's senior staff. The room was filled with officers who had decades of military experience between them. They had served in wars, led Marines in combat, and dealt with every kind of crisis imaginable. But this case had them all frustrated and angry. "This isn't just about one Marine," Colonel Thompson told the assembled officers. "This is about the relationship between our military and the communities we serve. If we don't stand up for David, we're sending a message that it's okay to treat our Marines this way." The military investigation also uncovered something that would prove crucial to David's case. The traffic stop had taken place in a neighborhood where several military families lived. David hadn't been driving through some random area where he didn't belong. He had been visiting the family of Corporal James Wright, another Marine in his unit who had been wounded in their last deployment. The Wright family confirmed David's story. He had been invited for dinner along with several other Marines. Mrs. Wright had cooked a traditional home-cooked meal for the young Marines who had just returned from overseas. It was her way of saying thank you for their service and for taking care of her son during his recovery. "David is like a son to me," Mrs. Wright told the military investigators. "He visits regularly, helps with yard work, and always asks about James's recovery. He's one of the finest young men I've ever met. The idea that he would be arrested for visiting our family is just heartbreaking." The investigation also revealed that David had been driving the most direct route from the Wright family home back to the base. He hadn't been wandering around the neighborhood or acting suspiciously. He had simply been going home after visiting friends, just as he had told the police officers. As the evidence mounted, it became clear that David had been the victim of a serious injustice. But the military investigators also realized that this case was bigger than anything they could handle at the base level. The pattern of behavior they had uncovered, the federal funding issues, and the potential impact on military-civilian relations meant that this case needed attention from the highest levels of military command. Colonel Thompson made the decision to forward the case up the chain of command. He prepared a detailed report that documented not just David's arrest, but the entire pattern of problems between local police and military personnel. He included recommendations for policy changes, training programs, and oversight mechanisms that could prevent similar incidents in the future. The report made its way through various levels of military bureaucracy, each stop adding more weight and urgency to David's case. Brigade commanders reviewed it. Division generals studied it. Corps commanders discussed it in meetings. And eventually, it landed on the desk of a four-star general who had built her career on principles of justice, fairness, and protecting the Marines under her command. By the time David had spent 3 days in jail, his case had become a priority for some of the most senior military leaders in the country. He didn't know it yet, but his arrest had set in motion a chain of events that would reach all the way to the Pentagon and change his life forever. General Catherine Hayes was having her morning briefing when the report landed on her desk. As a four-star general, she received hundreds of reports every week from military bases across the country. Most were routine matters that required nothing more than her signature or a brief review. But this one was different. The report from Camp Lejeune caught her attention immediately. The title alone made her pause. Systematic issues between local law enforcement and military personnel. Urgent. Review required. General Hayes had been in the military for 38 years, and she had learned to recognize when something needed her immediate attention. She dismissed her staff and closed her office door. For the next 2 hours, she read every page of the report, studying the evidence, reviewing the body camera footage, and examining the pattern of incidents that had been documented. With each page, her anger grew. General Hayes had not reached her position by accident. She was one of only 7 women to ever achieve the rank of four-star general in the United States military. She had commanded troops in combat, led major military operations, and earned the respect of everyone who served under her. But more than anything, she was known for her unwavering commitment to protecting the Marines and soldiers under her command. Born in a small town in Ohio, Catherine Hayes had joined the military as a young lieutenant fresh out of college. She had faced discrimination and challenges that her male counterparts never had to deal with. She knew what it felt like to be judged not by your abilities or character, but by things you couldn't control. That experience had shaped her entire career and made her especially sensitive to injustice. Over the years, General Hayes had built a reputation as a leader who would go to extraordinary lengths to protect her people. She had personally intervened in cases where military personnel were being treated unfairly. She had changed policies that discriminated against women and minorities. She had stood up to politicians, bureaucrats, and even other generals when she believed her people were being wronged. But David's case was different from anything she had encountered before. The evidence was so clear, the injustice so obvious, that she couldn't understand how it had been allowed to happen. Here was a decorated combat veteran, a Marine who had risked his life for his country multiple times, sitting in a civilian jail on charges that everyone knew were false. General. Hayes picked up her secure phone and called Colonel Thompson at Camp Lejeune. The conversation was brief but intense. "Colonel, I've reviewed your report on Staff Sergeant Johnson," she said. "I want you to know that this case now has my personal attention. What do you need from me?" Colonel Thompson was surprised to be receiving a call from a four-star general about one of his Marines, but he quickly briefed her on the current situation. David was still in jail, unable to make bail because of the serious nature of the charges. The local district attorney seemed unwilling to consider dropping the case, and the police department was standing behind their officer's version of events. "General, we've done everything we can at the base level," Colonel Thompson explained. "But this is going to require intervention from someone with more authority than I have." General Hayes was already thinking ahead. She had connections throughout the military and civilian government. She knew district attorneys, judges, and politicians who owed her favors. More importantly, She understood the power of her position and wasn't afraid to use it when necessary. After ending the call with Colonel Thompson, General Hayes spent the rest of the day making phone calls and reviewing David's complete military record. What she found impressed her even more than the initial report had suggested. David's service record was extraordinary. He had enlisted straight out of high school, motivated by a desire to serve his country after the September 11th attacks. His test scores and physical fitness evaluations put him in the top 5% of all recruits, but it was his performance in combat that really set him apart. During his first deployment to Afghanistan, David had shown remarkable skill as a marksman and exceptional courage under fire. His commanding officers consistently rated him as one of the best Marines they had ever worked with. By his second deployment, he was leading other snipers and training new Marines in advanced combat techniques. But it was during his third deployment that David had truly distinguished himself. The report described a mission where his unit had been ambushed by enemy forces. Several Marines had been wounded and pinned down by enemy fire. David had single-handedly held off the attackers for over an hour, allowing medical evacuation helicopters to rescue the wounded Marines. For that action, David had been recommended for the Silver Star, one of the military's highest honors for combat bravery. The paperwork was still being processed, but his commanding officers in Afghanistan had already written glowing recommendations describing his heroism and leadership. General Hayes also reviewed the personal statements that David's fellow Marines had written about him. These weren't official military documents, but heartfelt testimonials from the men and women who had served alongside him in combat. Corporal Anderson wrote about how David had saved his life during a mortar attack, carrying him to safety while under enemy fire. Sergeant Martinez described David's patience and skill in training new snipers, how he had taken extra time to make sure everyone in the unit was prepared for combat. Lance Corporal Foster talked about David's character, how he never complained about difficult conditions and always put the needs of other Marines before his own. The picture that emerged was of a Marine who embodied everything the military stood for: courage, honor, commitment, and selfless service. The idea that such a person could be sitting in jail on false charges was unacceptable to General Hayes. She also learned more about David's background. He had grown up in a working-class family, where military service was highly respected. His father had served in Vietnam, and his grandfather had fought in World War II. David's decision to join the Marines had been motivated not by a lack of other options, but by a genuine desire to serve his country and follow in his family's footsteps. David had never been in trouble with the law before his arrest. His record was completely clean, both as a civilian and as a Marine. He didn't drink alcohol, didn't use drugs, and spent most of his free time either training, studying, or volunteering in the community. The charges against him were so out of character that they would have been laughable if the consequences weren't so serious. General Hayes spent that evening reviewing legal precedents and consulting with military lawyers. She learned that while it was unusual for a general to intervene directly in a civilian court case, it wasn't unprecedented. Military leaders had a responsibility to protect their personnel, especially when those personnel were being treated unjustly by civilian authorities. The next morning, General Hayes made a decision that would define the rest of her career. She was going to personally intervene in David's case, not just as a character witness, but as a statement about how the military protects its own. She called her chief of staff and told him to clear her schedule for the next week. She was going to North Carolina to attend David's court hearing, and she was going to make sure that everyone involved understood the military's position on this case. The decision wasn't made lightly. General Hayes knew that her intervention could be controversial. Some people might accuse her of overstepping her authority or interfering with civilian law enforcement. There could be political consequences, media attention, and criticism from people who didn't understand the full situation. But General Hayes had not reached her position by avoiding difficult decisions. She had built her career on doing what was right, even when it was unpopular or risky. And in this case, she was absolutely certain that she was doing the right thing. She spent the next several days coordinating with various officials. She spoke with the district attorney's office to inform them of her intention to appear at David's hearing. She contacted the local NAACP chapter and other civil rights organizations to make sure they understood the military's position. She even reached out to local media outlets to ensure that David's story would be told accurately. General Hayes also took the time to learn more about the community where David had been arrested. She discovered that the area had a long history of military service with thousands of active duty and retired military personnel living in the region. The relationship between the military and civilian community had generally been positive, which made David's treatment even more troubling. She learned that the police department had received federal grants specifically designed to improve relations with the military community. That money was supposed to fund training programs, community outreach, and policies that would prevent exactly the kind of incident that had happened to David. The fact that these programs had apparently failed was another reason for General Hayes to get involved. The more she learned about the case, the more convinced General Hayes became that this was about more than just one Marine. This was about fundamental principles of justice, fairness, and respect for those who serve their country. If David could be treated this way despite his exemplary service record, then any Marine could face the same injustice. General Hayes also thought about the message that David's arrest sent to other young people considering military service. If the military couldn't protect its own people from false arrests and discrimination, why would anyone want to serve? The military depended on attracting the best and brightest young Americans, and cases like David's could seriously damage recruiting efforts. 3 days before David's scheduled court hearing, General Hayes flew to North Carolina. She didn't make a big show of her arrival, but word quickly spread through the military community that a 4-star general was personally involving herself in the case. The night before the hearing, General Hayes met with David for the first time. The meeting took place in a conference room at the base, away from the media attention that was starting to build around the case. David stood at attention when the general entered the room, but she immediately told him to relax. For the next hour, they talked not as general and enlisted Marine, but as two people who had dedicated their lives to serving their country. General Hayes was impressed by David's composure and dignity. Despite everything he had been through, he showed no bitterness or anger. He was more concerned about the impact his arrest might have on the Marines still serving overseas than he was about his own situation. "General, I just want to get back to my unit," David told her. "My Marines are depending on me, and I've never let them down before." That statement confirmed everything General Hayes had read in David's file. Even facing the possibility of a ruined career and a criminal record, his first concern was for the Marines under his command. It was exactly the kind of selfless attitude that made the military great. As General Hayes prepared for the next day's court hearing, she knew that she was about to make history. Her appearance in that courtroom would send a message that would be heard throughout the military and civilian communities. She was ready to put her reputation and her career on the line for a Marine she barely knew, because that's what leaders do. The morning of the hearing arrived with unusual activity outside the county courthouse. News vans lined the street, reporters checked their equipment, and crowds of people gathered on the courthouse steps. Word had leaked that a 4-star general would be appearing in court, and everyone wanted to witness what was about to happen. David sat in the holding cell, wearing the same civilian clothes he had been arrested in days earlier. His military lawyer, Captain Jennifer Walsh, had briefed him on what to expect, but nothing could have prepared him for the circus that was building outside. Through the small window, he could see the media gathering and wondered how his simple traffic stop had become such a big story. Inside the courtroom, every seat was filled. Military personnel from Camp Lejeune occupied the first several rows, their dress uniforms creating a sea of green. Local community members, civil rights activists, and curious citizens packed the remaining seats. The atmosphere was tense with anticipation. Judge Robert Harrison had been on the bench for 15 years, but he had never presided over a case quite like this one. He had received calls from politicians, military officials, and community leaders, all expressing interest in the proceedings. The judge knew that his handling of this case would be scrutinized by people far beyond his small courthouse. District Attorney Patricia Coleman was also feeling the pressure. She had reviewed the case file multiple times, watched the body camera footage, and consulted with her most experienced prosecutors. The evidence against David was weak at best, and she knew it. But dropping the charges now, especially with so much public attention, would be admitting that her office had made a serious mistake. At exactly 9 o'clock, the bailiff called the court to order. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Harrison," he announced. The packed courtroom stood as one, the sound of hundreds of people rising echoing through the chamber. Judge Harrison took his seat and surveyed the crowded courtroom. He had never seen so many people at a simple arraignment hearing. The case that had started as a routine traffic stop had clearly become something much bigger. "Be seated," the judge said, and the crowd settled back into their chairs. "We are here today for the arraignment of David Johnson, charged with resisting arrest and disorderly conduct. Is the defendant present?" David stood up at the defense table, his military bearing evident even in civilian clothes. "Yes, Your Honor," he replied clearly. "And is counsel present for both sides?" the judge asked. Captain Walsh stood up for the defense. "Captain Jennifer Walsh, representing Staff Sergeant Johnson, Your Honor." The prosecutor also stood. "Assistant District Attorney Michael Roberts for the state, Your Honor." Judge Harrison was about to proceed with the standard arraignment process when the bailiff approached his bench. "Your Honor, there's a request to address the court before we begin." The judge looked puzzled. This was highly unusual. "What kind of request?" "General Catherine Hayes is here and wishes to speak to the court, Your Honor." A murmur went through the packed courtroom. Everyone had heard that a general might appear, but seeing it actually happen was something else entirely. Judge Harrison had never had a 4-star general in his courtroom before. "Very well," the judge said. "The court will hear from General Hayes." The bailiff opened the courtroom doors and General Hayes entered. She was wearing her dress blue uniform, with ribbons and medals covering her chest. 4 stars gleamed on her shoulders, and her bearing commanded immediate respect. Every person in the courtroom stood without being asked, a spontaneous show of respect for her rank and service. General Hayes walked slowly down the center aisle, her eyes focused straight ahead. The only sound in the courtroom was the clicking of her polished shoes on the marble floor. When she reached the front of the courtroom, she turned to face the judge. "Your Honor, I am General Catherine Hayes, United States Marine Corps. I request permission to address the court regarding Staff Sergeant David Johnson." Judge Harrison was clearly impressed and somewhat intimidated by the general's presence. "General Hayes, you have the court's permission to speak." General Hayes positioned herself where everyone in the courtroom could see her. She had given speeches to Congress, briefed presidents, and addressed thousands of troops, but this moment felt different. This was personal. "Your Honor, members of the court, I appear before you today not just as a general, but as someone who has spent nearly 4 decades serving this great nation. I have commanded troops in combat, led Marines through the most dangerous missions imaginable, and had the honor of working alongside some of the finest men and women America has ever produced." Her voice carried clearly through the silent courtroom. Every person present was hanging on her every word. Staff Sergeant David Johnson is one of those exceptional Marines. Over the past week, I have reviewed his complete service record, spoken with his commanding officers, and read testimonials from the Marines who have served alongside him in combat. What I have found is a young man who embodies everything we hope for in our military personnel. General Hayes paused, looking directly at David, who was fighting back tears. He had never imagined that someone of her stature would even know his name, let alone come to his defense. During his 3 combat deployments to Afghanistan, Staff Sergeant Johnson has distinguished himself time and again. He has saved the lives of his fellow Marines under enemy fire. He has led dangerous missions with skill and courage. He has trained other Marines and helped prepare them for combat. His recommendations for the Silver Star are currently being processed, based on his heroic actions during his most recent deployment. The general's voice grew stronger as she continued. But Staff Sergeant Johnson's service record, impressive as it is not why I am here today. I am here because what happened to him represents a fundamental injustice that cannot be allowed to stand. She turned to face the prosecutor's table. "I have reviewed the body camera footage from the night of his arrest. I have seen how professionally and respectfully he conducted himself throughout that encounter. I have witnessed his compliance with lawful orders and his respectful assertion of his constitutional rights. What I saw was a Marine acting exactly as we train our personnel to act when dealing with law enforcement. The courtroom was completely silent. Even the reporters had stopped taking notes, captivated by the General's words. Your Honor, staff, Sergeant Johnson has spent years of his life in harm's way, protecting the very freedoms and rights that were denied to him on the night of his arrest. He has faced enemy fire to defend American principles of justice and equality. The irony that he would then be arrested for exercising those same rights is not lost on anyone in this courtroom. General Hayes moved closer to the judge's bench. I have served this country for 38 years. I have seen good Marines make mistakes, and when they do, the military justice system holds them accountable. But I have also seen good Marines wrongfully accused, and when that happens, it is my responsibility as their leader to stand up for them. She gestured toward David. Staff Sergeant Johnson is not just any Marine. He is one of our finest. His character has been tested in the crucible of combat, and he has never been found wanting. The charges against him are not just wrong. They are an insult to his service and to the uniform he wears with such honor. District Attorney Coleman was squirming in her seat. She had prosecuted thousands of cases, but she had never felt pressure like this. The General's words were not just a defense of one Marine. They were an indictment of the entire case against him. General Hayes continued. Your Honor, I am not here to interfere with civilian justice. I respect the independence of this court and the authority of civilian law enforcement. But I am here to provide context that this court needs to understand. Staff Sergeant Johnson is not a criminal. He is a hero who has sacrificed for his country and deserves better than what he has received. She paused, letting her words sink in. The Marine Corps takes care of its own. We do not abandon our Marines when they are wrongfully accused. We do not stand by silently when they are treated unjustly. And we do not forget those who have served with honor and distinction. Judge Harrison was visibly moved by the General's words. He had served in the National Guard himself and understood the bonds that connected military personnel. But he also knew that he had a job to do as a judge. General Hayes, the court appreciates your testimony regarding Staff Sergeant Johnson's character and service record. Is there anything else you wish to add? General Hayes looked around the courtroom one more time, making eye contact with David, then with the prosecutor, and finally with the judge. Your Honor, I have one final point. This case is not just about Staff Sergeant Johnson. It is about the message we send to all military personnel about how they will be treated when they return home from serving their country. If a Marine with an exemplary record like Staff Sergeant Johnson can be arrested on false charges, then no service member is safe. She straightened to her full height. The military community is watching this case closely. They want to know whether the sacrifices they make for their country will be respected, or whether they will be treated as suspects in their own homeland. Your Honor, you have the opportunity to send the right message today. With that, General Hayes stepped back. Thank you for allowing me to address the court. As she walked back toward her seat, the courtroom remained silent. The weight of her words hung in the air like a challenge to everyone present. District Attorney Coleman knew she was in an impossible position. The General's testimony had not only defended David's character, but it also highlighted the weakness of the prosecution's case. More importantly, it had turned this simple arraignment into a referendum on how the justice system treats military personnel. She stood up and approached the bench. Your Honor, in light of the testimony we have heard today, and after reviewing all the evidence in this case, the state moves to dismiss all charges against Staff Sergeant Johnson. The courtroom erupted. Marines cheered, reporters scrambled to capture the moment, and David collapsed into his chair, overwhelmed with relief and emotion. Judge Harrison banged his gavel for order. When the courtroom finally quieted, he looked directly at David. Staff Sergeant Johnson, please stand. David stood up, his legs shaking with emotion. The charges against you are hereby dismissed with prejudice, Judge Harrison said. But more than that, I want to personally apologize to you on behalf of our community. You have served our country with honor, and you deserved better treatment than you received. I hope you can forgive us and continue to serve with the same dedication you have shown." As David walked out of the courthouse a free man, General Hayes was waiting for him on the steps. The media swarmed around them, but she only had eyes for the young Marine whose life she had just helped save. "Semper Fi, Marine," she said, shaking his hand. "Semper Fi, ma'am," David replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for believing in me." "The Corps takes care of its own," General Hayes said. "Always remember that." The moment was captured by dozens of cameras and would be replayed on news programs across the country. But for David and General Hayes, it was simply a reminder of the bonds that connect all those who serve their country with honor.